We're going to try this like this. This might look a little funky, but we got a great big Nick Storm and a little bitty me down here in the corner. Welcome to Inside Look. I'm Jeff Lyons, joined today by a former colleague here at 14 News, Nick Storm, who's made it big in all the realms out there. You've done a lot since you left 14. How you doing, Nick?
I'm doing great, Jeff. It's great to be with you here today.
Yeah, it's good to see you too. And of course, you kind of became top of mind. You alerted me to this podcast, this Are You Captain Purple, which has really taken the podcast realm by storm. So we're going to get to that in just a couple minutes. All right, because I know you want to talk about that, and I've got many questions about it too. But just to give context to our regular listeners here and viewers, let's describe how you got to 14 News. And just for one disclosure, we first crossed paths in a class at USI. You were in my class for broadcast performance, and I, of course, gave you the sage advice you should go into weather because you had that great last name, Storm. You did none of that, but you've succeeded nonetheless. So kind of walk us through that. You're from Shelbyville. How did you get to 14 News and then beyond?
Yeah, it was quite the route. So I came to Evansville for college. I went to USI, as you said. I started working in media while I was in college, actually at a competitor, and then came to 14, I think in 05 or 06, as a weekend editor. I also did writing for the website at the time, and eventually went over to do marketing, topical marketing. So you and I worked together in that realm. After that, I moved to Louisville, Kentucky, was a reporter for a number of years, and then an anchor and managing editor of a television show covering Kentucky politics. Went to work after doing that for 6 or 7 years for the United States Department of Justice as the communications director. So served at an interesting time during rioting in Louisville, Kentucky. Bounced around a little bit after that, doing some communications work. I owned a political website for a while, and also have done some, documentary film work and different things like that. And obviously the podcast and still in the communications world.
Yeah. Well, I had a question about this, and don't take it the wrong way. You were always kind of a quiet guy when you were here. Who knew? So what was the spark to kind of go to the other side of the camera, more or less, and go into journalism?
Sure. For me, I think it was just having that. I wanted to spend time on the other side of the camera before ever stepping in front of it. So I felt like I didn't have much to offer in the beginning. I really wanted to understand both the industry and what was happening in the world before I ever jumped in front of the camera and offered myself up in that way. I always thought, it'd be great to be in that realm, but I didn't feel like I really had the thing to offer. And so once it kind of clicked into place for me of, I'm super passionate about politics and keeping people informed, that was really my entry point. But even when I was working at 14, I had started already on the documentary side. So I've always been a guy that's kind of had multiple things going on at the same time.
Yeah, but you had like zero interest in covering the wrecks and the fires and doing that kind of stuff in local news, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
So you go to Louisville, and now you're starting to work. Is this Spectrum News that you were working for, or who was the outlet that you were doing your reporting for?
It became Spectrum. So when I signed on, it was Insight and it was CN2. And then that took, cable companies are always being bought and sold. So it took a bunch of different looks over the years that I was there. I think I was there for 7 years. So it started as Insight, and then it was Charter and Comcast, and, they bought and sold, and it would be held by the FCC, and eventually became Spectrum.
Yeah. What was your first big story? Like when you knew you were going to do this now, you were going to be a journalist and an investigative journalist at that, which is kind of the next step up from the fires and the wrecks. I mean, these stories require a lot of preparation and contacts and so forth. So how did you work into that? That had to be a tough break to get in.
It did. So I first started just covering general sessions, and I had an interest in not the day-to-day movings of the bills, but why things were happening. And so it was really that was my entry point in that nexus. And it was figuring out, okay, who are the personalities? Who are they connected to? Who's really pulling the strings, as it were? And so that really was what got me into the investigative side. And there were different stories along the way. There would be campaign stories of this campaign did this thing, and here's why that thing happened. Here's where the money's really coming from that pulled those juices up. But I think the big story, at least here in Kentucky, that everybody knows me from is the Julian Carroll, former Governor Julian Carroll sex scandal. I broke that story, and it kind of went nuts there for a little while.
Yeah, that had to be thrilling, but on the other hand, it had to be terrifying too, because you had to make absolutely sure everything was right. And I'm
Hmm.
sure that it was not well received in some corners, probably. So, how did you navigate that?
Yeah, it was trusting the information. It was double, triple verifying. And at that point, it was very much. I knew in my heart of hearts why I was doing the story, and I knew it was going to come as a shock to a lot of people who really loved this person. But the reason to bring it forward to make sure there weren't any other victims, and the victims that could potentially be out there would have some vindication. Some of those stories become messy fast, and you can only really bring it up to a certain point to tell it. And for me, it was always, I'm not going to be one of those guys that spends a lot of time in the comment section. I'm not going to get too caught up on what people are saying.
Yeah.
You got to know what you're doing is for the right reasons, and be willing to take both sides. And I always felt like it was a good day if I kind of got love, but also got hit at the same time.
Yeah. So, what was an average day like? Did you just kind of hang out at the State House and take it all in, or did you, I mean, how did I just this is always inconceivable to me how you break into that because it seems so complex. I mean, not only politics in general, but the personalities involved. There's so many of them.
Mhm.
Everybody has these competing interests. So you're kind of an observer. I mean, as a journalist, you're an observer, and yet you got to take it all in and start connecting the dots. Did you have anybody to help you, or like a mentor, or did you just figure it out?
Mhm. It was a little bit of both. So I definitely had a mentor. When I went to work for the station in Louisville, there was a anchor and managing editor at the time who was invaluable to me to help me get myself set up in the right way. And his name is Ryan Alessi. He's now in Virginia. So he showed me the ropes.
Yeah.
But then there was just a lot of hard work. It was hanging out at the State House. It was going to, rubber chicken dinners and just meeting all of these people. And so I went, kind of around the clock for the first couple of years, just really getting myself set up in such a way. And then I got to a point where it was, okay, what do I want to do? And it was really the investigations that were interesting to me. And it was really, how far can we take it in a way that makes a difference? And so it was always that what makes a difference, right? Not just getting my name in the paper, or getting a hit on TV, or getting a follower on Twitter, or whatever it might be. It was, how can I make things better than what they are, and how can I tell the people that I'm really feel like I'm working for? Because not everybody has that level of access. If I'm going to be talking to a politician, I want to make sure that I know where regular people are at and what it is they're interested in finding out as well.
How did you get answers out of people, politicians in particular, that you could trust? And I'm not,
That's a, yeah.
saying all politicians are difficult, but in my experience, very limited experience, when someone holds political office, they tend to be pretty guarded, especially around media people and a journalist, especially, because they know, like it or not, they're on the record. So how do you
Sure.
navigate that one?
There's this Hunter S. Thompson quote that I love, and that's the 5 hours. And so, you show up in times and in places where you build trust. They see you enough and tell you enough, and so it's becoming a source to people that they can then trust. And that's a two-way street. I say often that I spent a career being lied to, and so it was being able to figure out, who's lying, who's telling the truth, who's giving me things that are checking out, and then like how do I show worth on my end too, and always be above board, and kind of gained a reputation. You could give me something that wasn't fully worked. Often, in this industry, somebody is something they want to get out into the realm of media. They'll say, okay, here it is, and put a pretty bow on it, and go tell people this. But I gained a reputation of being able to take a nugget of information and turn it into a story.
Yeah.
And so I think that was really a feather in my cap.
Then you went on the other side, so to speak, when you're working for the Secretary of State. Now you're communications director, you're managing the message going out. So how do you do that flip?
Yeah, yeah. So it's essentially the same thing in an opposite direction, right? here's information people need to know. Here's how I can give you that information. And I was lucky to work with a number of very good former journalists that ended up in the comm side. You know, one of the first people that I ran into when coming into Kentucky was Kerry Richardson, another 14 WFIE alum, who was working for then Governor Steve Beshear. And so it's, you know, it's those great comms directors that I think teach you as a journalist how to be a comms director.
Yeah, yeah. So you kind of learn the ropes from the inside that way. Do you want to get Kerry Richardson on here too? That's a good. I'm getting
Yeah, there you go.
another lead here with this podcast. Well, speaking of podcasts, and I want to kind of switch to that because I'm pretty wrapped up right now in Are You Mr. Purple or Captain Purple, and I don't want to be a spoiler in any way. However, let talk about that a little bit. It's a true story. How did you find out about it? And just kind of give us the overview of it. Then I'm going to start
Sure.
asking my selfish questions.
Yes, please do. Actually, it was one of those instances where you're kind of outside the 9 to 5 hours. I went to a friend's house that was having a barbecue, and as you do, you tend to introduce yourself by the careers you've had. And so, you know, I'm Nick Storm, and you know, I've got this media company at the time, and I was meeting somebody who had had a career as a musician, and Derek Ingersoll, who's in the podcast. And Derek says, you know, I've played with this band and opened for these guys, and you know, really big names. But the thing that or the story that always comes up is the hometown stories that we tell. And for him, it was this Captain Purple guy who, you know, he knew a little bit about from doing some initial research and said, you know, I'm working on a podcast. And he tells me the background story. There's this guy that ran around in the 1980s and he left things at people's houses and purple spray painted shoe prints. And people kind of lost their minds. They weren't sure what was going on.
Right.
And for him as an 8-year-old, you know, he sees this superhero emerge, and it's like, you know, you got to be kidding. That's the wildest true story I've ever heard. And
Yeah,
so
yeah, and all
immediately I said,
in
I'm in.
Bedford, Indiana. You know, who knew? I mean, I looked at after I listened to a couple episodes. You know, I went back as you do and Googled it and looked around and everything, and of course it was true. And I knew people from Bedford who worked here at the station, Jim Sears, Dean Webster. They never mentioned it. Of course, they were younger, or they would have been older, so not in Bedford in 1983. But in listening to the podcast, it sounds almost like the audio too, almost like a true crime story, even though it's not a crime. I mean, the guy is doing good; he's a do-gooder. You know, there's lots of nat sound and all these actualities and everything. So, how do you? What was the process? I mean, did you just go with your mic and interview people just as you would do as a journalist, or how did you pull that together? And then you created an arc of 8 episodes, right? Is it
That's
8?
right. Yeah.
Okay,
It's
and no,
8.
yeah.
So the
I'm not up
first
to 8 yet.
7.
You're right.
Okay. Yeah. So the first 7 episodes are 30 minutes long, and then the finale is a full hour.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, it was gumshoe journalism 101, right? It's the stuff you learn in college. But that, as you find out once you get in the profession, is rarely used, right? Like, it's not often that, you know, your assignment editor or news director will give you a day to go and play, right? And so that's kind of what this was. It was going out with a microphone. You know, Derek would get in the car and, you know, and say, okay, we're heading to Bedford from Louisville. Let's see what we can find. And we had a list of people we knew we wanted to talk to. And so initially it was just going and locating those people. And he had reached out before to some of them with minimal success. And so we did just start showing up, and I started knocking on doors, and, you know, one source led to the next, until we're, you know, working our way through, you know, former mayors and detectives that were on the police force. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Jeff. It really is told like true crime. It's just positive true crime.
Yeah.
There are no gruesome details here.
And I looked at of course, you have a companion website, and you can go on and see material. So, like, you had the police report that had been redacted, you know, in different places. And so it's like, oh, wow, how'd they get that, you know? And a lot of your subjects, you know, the police officers in that were like, what, in their 70s? Because this was 40 years ago. So they were, you know, obviously retired and had moved on, or not moved on, but were definitely not in the field anymore. So as you pointed out, you know, were their memories fuzzy? Were they hiding things? You know, and as a journalist, you're kind of trained to recognize, you know, lies. And you weren't seeing that. So that your heart rate must have gone up a little bit each little step you took, in Bedford.
Absolutely. And at first we didn't know, right? We'd be out there and, Derek had heard some of these things and, I didn't know, right? You go out there with the microphone and you hope that you can turn this into something, but is this a single episode? Is this 5 episodes? How much are we going to get from what we can find? And, that first episode sort of ends on a cliffhanger, and that's pretty real time. I mean, those first couple interviews we're doing are in that first episode that kind of lead into these narratives that we play with. Like, what did the police know and when? And were they covering up for somebody else? And who all could have been in on something like this? Is there some grand conspiracy at play to do good?
Yeah, but I know, well, that's kind of the irony that the police were even involved. I mean, the guy's just leaving groceries and medicine. I mean, he wasn't doing any crime. He was just helping people. And I guess that's the bigger message you're trying to put out, right? Is that you can do good in the world and make a difference.
Absolutely. And that it still ripples today. I mean, we're seeing ripples from the story, and we hear from people who were visited by Captain Purple back in 1983 and the way that it changed their lives over the next 40 plus years, all the way to today. I mean, after the podcast came out, we got a note from a teacher in Nova Scotia who was listening to the podcast with her students, and they started up a Purple Pantry, and they're helping people in their village in Nova Scotia. And so, the story continues to ripple.
Yeah, and the podcast itself, it among the top on at least Apple, or was it Spotify? I can't remember.
Apple, yeah.
Apple, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was up there. So that had to be a thrill. Was that a first for you to have something really go big like that?
I've had stories go viral. I've written some national stories that have had, million plus clicks in the first few days. But the first long form, like podcast is my first real podcast in this format that, we put it out there. It's all independently financed and produced, and we had high hopes, but to get picked up by Apple, and then it's still in the top 100 series on Apple, top 200 podcasts in the United States of America. It is wild to see, and really heartwarming to see a genre-defying podcast that is about inherent good and radical love do so well.
Yeah, and the other thing is just the production value of it. How long did it take to get a half-hour episode put together? As we know, editing a story and getting it, to your liking is often the work nobody sees, and it takes the most time. These things sound like they took quite a bit of time and effort and love and care.
It did. I'd say that we were in the field the better part of 3 months, of a little bit of extra reporting, maybe 3 extra weeks near the end of the year. But a majority of the reporting was done in 3 or 4 months. And then the rest of the year was spent putting these together. The writing, I wrote these. I would do a rough out edit, just assemble edit. Here's a sound bite. Here's my voice in a rough format, which I would then send on to Derek, who would mix down into something that we liked. And some of the episodes came together incredibly fast. I've told a few people this. I wrote a few of these episodes in doctors' offices and at other appointments, and then others of them, you kind of have to work with. One thing that we did at the very beginning, after we had done the reporting, was to work on a whiteboard, and we sat together, and here's our arc outlines. Here's episode 1. Here's episode 2. And so we had the framework to work within, and then it was just fine tuning, and luckily ended up working with Derek, who's incredibly talented as both a musician and in the audio realm, and then had final level mastering by Owen Beverly, who was just took everything over the top.
Yeah, and they're great to listen to. It's almost like an old time. I'm old enough to remember, I had a class in college on golden age of radio, and you would listen to these mystery stories and that with the sound effects and everything. But it's just really compelling, and I'm so happy that it blew up for you, and that you have your tie here to 14. We can claim no credit, of course, for for your success in the podcast because they didn't have them when you were here. But so what next then for you? What's your next hurdle or next goal?
Yeah, we definitely want to do more. And Derek and I, working together, want to tell more stories. We want to tell more positive stories. I can't say exactly what we're working on next. It'll probably be a little bit bigger next time. There are some companies that have expressed some interest in working with us, but nothing finalized yet. But don't count us out as far as a small hometown mystery. There's actually some Evansville stories I might be interested in telling at some point.
That'll be good. Hopefully, they don't revolve around 14 News. Although, if they do, be sure and let us know. You got to hang around more barbecues, right, to get these great
That's
story
right.
leads and that
That's
sort
right.
of thing. Well, Nick Storm, it's been great talking to you. The name of Nick's podcast is Are You Captain Purple? And it is a true story set in 1983 in Bedford, Indiana. Nick Storm and Ingersoll, I can't remember the guy's first name.
Derek Ingersoll.
Derek Ingersoll put this together, but it's a great listen, and it's fun knowing, we knew you when you were here. And, there's still time for you to go into meteorology. I still think Nick Storm would be the ideal weatherman name, but, you still got some time, right?
I do. There's plenty of years left.
Okay, thanks a lot. This is Nick Storm. I'm Jeff Lyons with Inside Look. Thanks for joining. You can listen to all the Inside Looks wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch on the 14 News YouTube channel. For Inside Look, I'm Jeff Lyons.